A report released earlier this month revealed that just 60,000 people across the world, that's 0.001% of the world's population, controls 3 times more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population combined. In addition, 10% of the world's population earn more income than the other 90% combined. I'm Jahnavi Sen, and with me today to talk about the World Inequality Report 2026 is economist Lucas Chancel. He's one of the lead authors of the report and also co-director of the World Inequality Lab at the Paris School of Economics.
Hi. Hello.
Hi. I want to start with a very basic question. Your report highlights the extremely stark and unrelenting inequalities we're seeing in the world today, and the last such report was released in 2022. Have there been any big changes since then that you have witnessed, or what are the patterns that are concretizing?
Well, what we see is really this is the era of the global super rich, and their share in global wealth is increasing. In fact, the world economic system is creating the condition of its own failure and potential collapse, because it creates these massive inequalities that are really not sustainable from a political or democratic point of view, nor even an economic point of view. And the system also creates pollution that in itself is also making the whole world system it's at the brink of collapse. So this past year, the past year was the highest ever recorded at the global level, and it's increasing the risks of climate-related catastrophes and events. And at the same time, as we were just discussing, so inequalities are rising at the very, very top of the distribution, and this has continued over the past 4 years since the release of the last report. What we also see at the global level is extreme poverty at the global level has stopped declining. So this was really something that we observed in the 2000s, in the early 2010s, but since a small decade, a little less than 10 years ago, extreme poverty is not declining anymore. So we have global inequalities that are rising, and there's a widening gap between the bottom and the very, very top of the distribution, this stadium, as you were referring to it, representing more or less 60,000 people that are capturing an ever-growing share of the pie.
Since I'm talking to you from India, I'm interested in how India fits into this entire dynamic. Your report refers to India as one of the most unequal countries in the world, where just 1% of the population controls about 40% of the total wealth. Could you talk a little bit more about your findings from India?
Yeah, what we see is a level of income and wealth inequality in India that is absolutely extreme. From a historical perspective, between 1922, that's the first year for which we have this data, and today, the latest data points we have are in 2022, 2023, and we can talk of the difficulty to access up-to-date data in India. But what we see is that the top 1% income share is around 22, 23% today. And this is higher than the levels that we observed in the 1930s, at least before independence. So, this really is the key defining characteristic of the Indian economy today. We've talked of the billionaire Raj that has replaced the British Raj in a way, and that's for income. But wealth, this very other important dimension of economic inequality. So income is what you earn, and wealth is what you own, right? And when we look at wealth inequality, the picture is also very stark, with a relatively strong rise of the top 1% wealth share in India. So how much the 1% richest own, as compared to everything there is to own in India. Well, this value was around 30%, 30 to 33% in the early 2000s, and it has risen to 40% today. And so there's also a very strong rise of wealth inequality in India, which really mirrors this rise of income inequalities. And so some have also called this conglomerate capitalism. And so it's an economy that really works very, very well for little few. And I think this is something that the Indian population can also feel. You don't necessarily need the statistics to see this. You can also read newspaper stories about billionaires, and when you see the reality on the ground, it's also a dual economy. A part of the country is not growing when you see this extreme rise of inequality and wealth at the very, very top. And in this way, India mirrors in a way what is happening at the global level. Now, the good news from this report is that countries have been able to reduce inequality. They've been able to do that in the past. Some countries are still able to do this today. And what we learn from this big collective effort that we're doing, looking at all countries in the world, looking at what's happening now, but also in the past, we see that it's possible to reduce inequality, to do this in a way that's good for the economy. And in fact, countries that achieved the highest level of prosperity or of per capita GDP are countries that were able to reduce massively their income inequalities. And they were able to do this in a way that was democratic, in a way, that allowed for elections, opposition parties, free press. So it's really, all of this can be combined. And in fact, we think that reducing inequality is a necessary step if we really want to address the big challenges of the 21st century.
I will come back to that on what the report says in terms of steps that can be taken to reduce inequality, but I want to go back to something else you mentioned. You talked about the availability of data from India, and I want to ask you, when you're putting something together of this scale, a global report, how much is both the availability, the access, and also the quality of data from India, is it a concern for you?
Yeah, it is clearly a concern, and in fact, it's become harder and harder to access good income and wealth inequality data. In fact, there have been some, ups and downs, back and forth over the past decade when it comes to accessing data in India. So, for instance, we had income tax statistics available from 1922 to 1998, but since this date, data release has been erratic. It has been incomplete. For instance, we didn't have tax data over the 1999-2010 period. And why it's important to have this tax data? Because it informs us on what is happening, among the very rich, those who pay the tax data, or at least who are supposed to pay it. The reality is actually potentially even worse than what we observe. So basically, researchers like us, we need to deal with these different data environment. The situation is not good in India. It's also, pretty bad in other countries. We come up with methods to reconstruct inequality data in the best way we can, in the most comparable and systematic way. We think our data is the most robust there is, because we produce, all the details of what we do. And so if others have access to better information, they can join the efforts, they can use the data, maybe improve it. And so far, we haven't really seen better information out there, unfortunately. So the situation is not good. I think it's really important to call for more data release from the part of the government, in particular when it comes to income and wealth inequality. But what we also do is that we use different sources. So we can also use Forbes lists, for instance, these rich lists, which inform us about the wealth of India's richest individuals. And, all these data sources that we might assemble some elements of income inequality data from that we are able to access from official sources, some rich lists or other surveys that are being carried out. They point towards this rise of inequality over the past 20 years.
I want to pan out a little bit again to the more global aspects of your report. There's a very interesting chapter on climate inequality and how the classes and even the regions that are most responsible for the emissions that we're seeing today are not the ones that are going to be the worst hit by the impacts of climate change. Could you talk a little bit about your research on that?
Yeah, so a little earlier I was saying that these levels of inequality that we observe are not sustainable. In fact, they're very much unsustainable. And in fact, the climate crisis is deeply connected with the climate and inequality crisis are deeply interconnected. How is that? Well, the richest individuals on the planet contribute much more than others to the problem. So what we show is that the top 10% of the world population contribute to half of global CO2 emissions. And this number can actually rise to 3/4, depending on how we count, how we attribute responsibilities. And in the two cases, this is a very stark number. So a very, strong concentration of CO2 emissions. But at the same time, as you referred to, there's a strong concentration of damages. And so those who are the worst hit, the most heavily impacted, are in the poorest countries of this planet. And we show that the bottom half of the world population concentrates 3/4 of relative income losses. So these are, how much climate-related disasters, climate increases in temperatures are going to hit your livelihoods, are going to harm your standard of living. And so there's this big concentration of, these damages. So it's a mirror image in a way. It's an asymmetric image. Those who contribute the most pollute. Those who contribute the most have the lowest level of relative harms, and at the same time, those who contribute the most also have most capacities to act. And so, this also contributes to explain why the situation is so complicated. It's because, if those who have the capacities to act and those who pollute faced, relatively little damage, then this is a recipe for further disaster to happen. Now, maybe if we think about the way forward, in fact, everybody is impacted by climate change now, and so it's also a story of how people, in particular in the global north, are realizing that their own lifestyles are also unsustainable. And so there can be alliances between, say, the working and the middle classes in the global north and the majority of the population in the global south in order to stop this unsustainable development path. And what we show is that, again, this is very connected with inequality, because in order to solve the climate crisis, we need huge amounts of investments in low carbon transportation systems, in making sure that our homes are energy efficient, in making sure that we are replacing coal power plants with sustainable energy power plants. And to do this, we need investments, we need cash, and basically taxing the rich, making sure that the richest individuals are paying their fair share of taxes, is a very important way to make sure that we have the resources to make these investments in these public goods that we desperately need to combat climate change. So again, high inequality is connected with high pollution levels. Reducing inequality with more taxes on the rich is also a way to do these investments we need to solve the climate crisis.
Another aspect you've covered is the inequalities that are inherent in the design of global financial systems, and how what used to be the exorbitant privilege of the US, because of the dollar being the main reserve currency in the world, is now sort of evenly distributed across rich countries. Could you talk about the way these systems function that are exacerbating inequalities?
Yeah, so what you're referring to is this term that was coined in the 1960s for the US, this exorbitant privilege. So you have this world economic superpower that has also the benefit of having this reserve currency, the dollar. And thanks to having this reserve currency, thanks to organizing the global financial system in a certain way, it's able to benefit from cheap access to capital. Basically, other countries are lending their money at very low interest rates to the US. So cheap access to capital and also being able to invest in the rest of the world and enjoy very high returns on this. What we show is that this privilege of the US in the 1960s has turned into a global North privilege. So it's not just the US anymore, it's also the Eurozone and it's also Japan. So the exorbitant privilege is a privilege of the rich world. And what does this mean? Well, it means that by design, the financial system is constructed in such a way that money flows in the wrong directions. It flows from the global south to the global north. So basically 1% of global GDP flows from poor countries to rich countries. So that's, profits made in the south but repatriated to where the owners are in the global north, many of these profits. But it's also interest on debt contracted by global south countries. When governments have little fiscal capacities, they borrow on global markets, and they borrow at interest rates which are extremely high. And this contributes to make this flow of international finance from the south to the north, when it should be the other way around if we want to reduce global inequalities. And in fact, this 1% GDP figure is extremely important, because if we compare it with flows of foreign development aid from global north countries to global south countries, well, these represent overall 0.3% of global GDP. So in fact, we have much more money flowing from the global south to the global north through what I'm talking about here, the exorbitant privilege, than what rich countries are giving back through foreign development aid, which, by the way, we also know that this aid also often tied to many conditionalities. This is not a result of, the free functioning of markets. It's how we've designed the international financial and monetary system. It can be changed. It has been changed in the past, and we think that it will need to be changed in the coming decades, again, in order to address these huge challenges, collective challenges of the 21st century. Again, this is potentially where there can be alliances between global south countries and a big part of the population in the global north, which has interest in seeing countries in the global south being able to make these necessary investments to combat climate change, but also, for instance, in their health system or in their education system.
While you were talking about climate change, you did mention that policies that tax the rich could be a way to combat the impacts that we're seeing and try to reverse some of these trends. And overall, the report says very clearly that the level of inequalities we're seeing they're not inherent in the way the world has to function. These are outcomes of political and social choices that are being made. So I want to ask you more about that, the recommendations of progressive taxation and also of a global tax on multimillionaires comes out very strongly. So I want you to elaborate on those recommendations and also ask what you're seeing in terms of the political will to take those steps. Because in India, for instance, we know there was a wealth tax that was abolished in 2015. So globally, are you seeing a push for policies of that kind?
Right, yeah. So the key point here really is that inequality is not a law of nature. It's always a political choice. And societies have, the possibility to choose high level of inequalities, but they can also decide to reduce it. And in fact, if we look in a historical perspective, we see that in European countries, for instance, in the beginning of the 20th century, the income scale, the gap between the incomes of the bottom 50% of the population and the top 0.1% was more or less from 1 to 100. So that was the gap between the bottom and the top. This gap has been reduced to a scale of 1 to 10. So we moved from 1 to 100 to 1 to 10. So that's a huge compression of the income gaps between the bottom and the top of the distribution. And in fact, this was a political choice. This was a political choice that was engineered through the rise of social security system, minimum wage, health security for all, education, primary, secondary, and in many cases, tertiary education, equal access to all this through public and government funding, and progressive income taxation, which has been an essential part of this redistribution cocktail and of this inequality reduction cocktail in so many countries. And so, why is progressive taxation important? Because it's one way to reduce inequalities directly when you are taxing the rich, but it's also one way to reduce inequalities indirectly through the money that is generated by taxation and that is reinvested to finance access to healthcare, to finance investments in improving the day-to-day conditions of lives, the roads, for instance, of poor territories and poor areas, for instance. And so this has been so critical in the 20th century. What we argue is that the next step really is to progressively tax wealth and not just income. Why is it important to tax wealth? Because a lot of super wealthy individuals today, they, don't have high incomes, at least they do not report in high levels of incomes to tax administrations because they're allowed to do so. They can hide a lot of their incomes. On the contrary, it's much harder to hide your wealth because when you are a super rich, essentially what you own is shares of multinational companies. It's very hard to hide this to tax authorities. Whether here you're hiding this in a legal or illegal way is not my point. My point is that tax authorities struggle to properly track the actual incomes of very, very wealthy people. But it would be much easier to them to properly track their wealth. And so that's why we are advocating for a minimum wealth tax on centimillionaires. And this is also what was spearheaded by President Lula at the G20 when Brazil had the presidency last year. And I think this idea, this proposal is moving forward. Several countries are seriously considering it. There was an intense parliamentary debate in France, which was very close, in fact, to implementing this law. It is not there yet, but it can be in the months to come, and other countries are considering it. We think so it is extremely important if we want to adapt our tax systems to the current characteristics of contemporary capitalism. So this rise of the super rich. And we definitely think that it would make a lot of sense for India to have such a tax because India lacks resources to invest in improving the daily life of millions and hundreds of millions of the population. And so in order to do so, in order to have better schools, better hospitals, better roads, better trained teachers, better railway systems, and all this contributes to having a flourishing economy, good, entrepreneurial skills. How can you have entrepreneurial skills if people are not well trained and if they are not well in good health? So in order for all this to function, a wealth tax is a very important ingredient. We think it's the way forward. We think that, in fact, in 50 years' time, when we will look back at this period, people will be like, yeah, why didn't they do it earlier? And more or less, this is what we are thinking or saying when we look at the past. There was a time when there was no income tax. We look at this past, we're like, yeah, it was strange to not have any income tax. Well, actually, 100 years ago, there was no income tax. It's become now very standard, very consensual. And we think that it is very likely that the same process will happen with the wealth tax. So we need to continue to show the benefits of such a tool to reduce inequality, and that is so critical.
Thank you also for bringing the Indian context. That was going to be my next question, but you have answered it already. So thank you so much for joining us today and for walking us through the findings of your report.
Thank you so much for the question, and hope to have this inequality discussion going on.
Absolutely.